In this video I show how I built this workbench, which is loaded with features. One is a Wagon Vise, which is great for clamping items while planing. Besides dog holes, it also has T-track up front for hold down clamps. It also has a face vise, which can also be used to clamp items to the front of the workbench. Now moving on to the build, I'm using 2x4s following my modular workbench design, although there are changes to make it stronger. Now I'm starting off with the legs. I'm cutting 8 pieces at 30 inches. With my 8 leg pieces, I'm gluing these together into 4 sets, so it'll make 4 corner legs. With the glue dry, I'm going to square up and cut these legs to size, and I'm using the table saw here, but of course if you have a joiner and planer, that would be really great for squaring up the legs. Now I'm moving on to the rest of the frame, which, of course, I'm using more 2x4s to make that. And I'm starting off by cutting 4 long width stretchers at 72 1/4 inches. Now this is different from my other modular workbench builds, which I usually build in segments, but I think this will make it a lot stronger, and you'll see when it's assembled what I mean. But next I'm cutting out 4 middle posts at 23 inches, and of course this is shorter than I usually cut the middle posts. And because of that, for assembly, I'm using this 21 3/4 inch spacer just to help align things. For assembling the front and back frames, I'm just starting first with 2 long width stretchers and 2 middle posts. And of course later the outer posts will be added, and I will connect the 2 frames together using depth stretchers, but I'm starting off this way just to make it easier for figuring out the alignment of everything. One thing I want to point out about aligning the outer posts is they shouldn't be centered, they should be sticking out on the outside of the workbench or opposite side of the pocket screws. The pocket screw side should be flush. Now I need depth stretchers. These just connect between the posts to connect these frames together. And so to start off with the depth stretchers, I'm cutting 8 pieces at 19 inches. Another change I'm making here from my normal modular workbench design is these middle depth stretchers are flush with the top. And the reason is I want to help span that distance for the top, since that's going to be across the grain. These cheap 2x4s seem to like to sag, so this is going to help with that. Now I have to add some extra material to the middle posts here so I can add dog holes. I want it to be flush with the outer posts. So starting off here, I'm cutting 2 pieces at 30 inches, and I added a 45-degree cut for looks. Now, unfortunately, I did have to plane these thinner, and this is poor planning on my part, so I just want to say you don't need a thickness planer. The problem is I need these pieces flush with the outer posts, but because I screwed up the orientation of the 2x4s and how I was shaping the outer posts, I screwed up the depth of them, the dimensions. But anyway, I realized this doesn't look good, and so I decided to use an electric hand plane to shape these pieces, just kind of going with my gut and trying to add more angles to them so it would look better than just a regular square piece. And what was kind of cool is as I was shaping this, I mean, first of all, it was a lot of fun, but I realized it looks like a chisel, which is kind of neat. And I guess that's what happens when you go with your gut on something. You kind of end up replicating what something else looks like, but I thought it was a really neat addition to the workbench. Next, I'm adding some extra supports for the top on the sides. Once again, this is for helping the top span across the grain. And for this, I'm cutting two pieces at 32 inches. And of course, 32 inches here, that's going to be the depth of my workbench top. And now after I cut these out, I thought, I had so much fun with the middle post shaping those with the electric hand plane, I thought I would do the same here. For the workbench finish, I'm trying out lacquer, so I swapped out my air filters for activated charcoal ones. I also cracked a door. Since it's winter, I had to balance fresh air and heat, but I'm also using a P100 paint respirator that's rated for volatile organic compounds. It's all combustible too, so you have to be careful. But my thought process was that maybe lacquer would be easier to repair and possibly more grippy than polyurethane, so do whatever you want. But after that, I could add dog holes to the middle posts here, and I just kind of took a guess at how far I wanted them. It really just kind of depends on your exact use case, but I aim for 3 or 4 inch spacing on dog holes typically. On this workbench, I'm having both adjustable feet and flip casters, and I like that combination versus just casters, because this way when I flip up the casters, not only can I level out the workbench, but it also doesn't slide around as I'm using it. So I'll have links in the description for both kinds that I use. Moving on to the top, I'm also making this out of 2x4s, and I'm starting off first by cutting all the 2x4s down to just over 7 feet, giving me a little bit of extra length so I can cut it clean at 7 feet when everything's glued together. For glue up, I glued all the 2x4s into 3 different sections because my plan here was to take each one of these sections and shove them through the thickness planer so that way they'd be an even thickness, and then I'd glue those together on the tabletop. But each of these sections were 50 pounds, which is not enjoyable to try to feed through a thickness planer. So I think a better option actually is just using the electric hand plane, which I had to do later anyway when flattening the top. With all those pieces prepped, I thought now was a better time than any to move the old workbench out of the way so I can move the frame in and start assembling the workbench on top of the frame. I'm using a biscuit joiner to add some slots for Z-clips. Now the front of the workbench will be bolted in place, but because it can expand and contract, I'm using Z-clips to help hold down the top flat. All of these pieces need to be jointed together, and rather than trying to deal with a joiner, I'm using a track saw, which a straight edge and a circular saw achieves the same thing here. Basically, you're using the kerf of the blade in order to cut both pieces at the same time so they fit together tight. Because my track saw doesn't cut all the way through, I flipped the top over so I could use a router with a flush trim bit. That actually didn't work very well, so I once again used the electric hand plane, which it's starting to sound like an ad, but it's not. I bought this with my own money because I thought it was neat. It had actually turned out to be insanely useful. But anyway, because I already had the top flipped over, I figured now is a better time than any to add a coat of finish because I'm getting really tired of flipping this 150-pound tabletop. But I'm adding the coat of finish here not for protection, but just to try to help control the moisture level so it doesn't warp or twist on me. Before attaching the top, the most important part for alignment is that it's flush with those 2 front middle posts with the dog holes. But what I'm doing is I'm bolting the front on. Like I said earlier, I'm using Z-clips to help hold it down, but the front I want bolted in place to maintain the flushness with those 2 middle posts in the front. Leg screws could be a great option for bolting the top down, but I'm using these threaded inserts. I use 1/4 bolts for everything. That's the same as these threaded inserts here. And this way, it's really easy to align the tabletop back up where it's supposed to go, and it's easy to unbolt or bolt on as many times you may need to. I used the electric plane once again to help flatten the top, and this is where I realized I wasted my time with the thickness planer, because all the pieces needed flattening anyway. But once it was flat, I could fill all the holes and cracks just with some black wood filler here, and this stuff worked okay. I'll have a link in the description for this, just like other parts I use. This one worked just fine. I know there's a lot of options. Some people really like epoxy, but if you're careful on how you choose your 2x4s or whatever wood you use, you probably won't even have this issue. Now, because I had so much fun shaping the middle posts as well as the top supports, I thought it would be fun to kind of continue that design, that sort of geometric shape design, all these hard lines. I thought it would be cool to add that to this workbench as well. And now this isn't going to hurt functionality. It technically would if you want a square end, but I didn't need that, so I was just going with what I thought would look neat. With the top shaped, I'm adding a coat of finish, and notice how I'm adding finish as soon as possible throughout this build. I am trying to add it quickly to help stabilize the parts, but also it's less finishing that I have to do later on. The first vise I'm adding is a wagon vise, or possibly a tail vise. I've seen kind of interchangeable uses of both of those terms, but what I have to do is add a 1 1/4 inch hole going through the side of the workbench here. I'm using this wagon vise for my dog hole system, so this way if I have work pieces up to about 6 feet in length, I can clamp them in place. Now this was very tricky. I had to be careful to make sure it was square because this hole is 18 inches long, so I had to make sure I wasn't going to drift through the workbench in different directions. I had to use these extenders as well to drill the hole. But once I had that done, I could cut out the dog hole section. It's just a part of the workbench that I'm cutting out where a block of wood with the dog hole in it will slide back and forth. And this is how I'll achieve the clamping mechanism that I mentioned. With this piece that I cut out, I can actually use this for the block that adjusts back and forth because the hole is already going to be lined up with where the thread is going to go. So this I'm just cutting down to about 6 inches in length. Now of course you can make this whatever you want. I'm mostly just trying to cut off the parts where I drilled out extra material, and I want to make sure it has enough room where it can slide back and forth with this collar piece. I got some thin strips of wood here that I'll be adding to try to prevent twisting. Because my jigsaw cut out so much material, this block of wood would twist back and forth as it slides along. So I'm gluing these onto the side so that way I can fine tune it so it doesn't twist or rotate too much within this cutout portion. I'm using some 2P10 CA glue to help attach the color to that block of wood. This way it's a lot easier to align everything initially before actually screwing it in place. For the bench dog, I had to cut this shorter, so I thought it would be cool to store it somewhere where I can quickly reach it, like on the side. So all I did is drilled a quick hole here, so that way when I clamp something in place, I can quickly grab it and it's ready to go. For adding the other dog holes here, these are spaced about 3 inches apart, and that's based on how much I can adjust the clamping mechanism here, so depending on what you use, you may want to change that. For the handle, my main concern is that it doesn't stick out where I run into it. So to make it, I'm using a 1-inch dowel and I'm cutting an 8-inch piece out of that. And now I need some ends on that. I'm using this 2-inch block, and I actually get to use the vise to help cut these out because I am, well, you can guess it. Once again, I'm using the electric hand plane to shape this. I'm trying to really go for this whole geometric hard line shape thing that I'm going for. I gotta get a better name for that, but I figured all the way through the workbench it would be cool if I have a consistent design. So I cut out this really weird shape out of that block, and I'm just cutting out 1-inch ends out of that that'll be screwed to the dowels, and I'll have the same thing for the other vise, which I'll add after this. Now I can add the front vise, which will be more of a traditional bench vise style. Now the first thing I have to do for this is joint a couple 2x4s together because I need that extra height for the vise plate. Aligning the vise can be really tricky, so what I'm going to do here to make it easier is I'm going to take off this end piece. This is all the holes I care about for lining up the threaded rod as well as the 2 guide bars, and from the inside underneath the workbench I'm drawing out where these holes are, and I'm going to drill just a pilot hole all the way through this end, so that way when I drill the actual size using my spade bits from the other side of the workbench, I can drill those there. Just makes the whole thing a whole lot easier, and this is, well, it actually turned out to be a really effective way for lining this up. Let me know in the comments though if you have an easier method for lining up vices on a workbench. Now I could trim the vise plate to the final size of 16 inches wide. Something to keep in mind is just make sure you plan ahead where you're going to trim when you're lining up the holes. But once I had that cut out, I did some more shaping here, once again using the electric hand plane, which this is really becoming the star of the Workbench build. And like I said, it's not sponsored, it's just something I thought would be cool to try out. And as I kept using it, it turned kind of a boring Workbench build into a really fun project because I could put my own flavor, my own touch on the Workbench to really make it unique for myself, instead of just another rectangle on legs. I'm adding dog holes to this vise as well. And now this vise really shines if I need 4 points of contact. On the vise plate here, I'm adding dog holes on either side, and then I'm going to continue those dog holes all the way along the Workbench. So this way, if I have a wider panel where I need 4 points of contact to really hold it in place, that's where this shines as opposed to the Wagon Vise. Going way back to the dog holes in the front, this is a feature I was talking about where I can clamp a panel or a piece of wood on the side. Now it's time to add the cabinets to each one of these bays so I can store my tools. I'm using 3/4 inch plywood for the cabinet boxes, and each box has 4 sides, all 21.5 inch squares. I also need 2 pieces for each cabinet box at 20 1/8, and it's not 20 because of the actual thickness of the plywood. For assembly, I'm just using glue and brad nails because that's easy, but keep in mind you can make your cabinets however you want. That's the real beauty of the modular design of the frame. As long as your cabinet fits inside the cabinet bays, then you're golden. Something I want to point out here is that I'm sandwiching the sides in between the top and bottom pieces to get the right dimensions for the box. Also, you see here, I'm using those offcuts I mentioned. I'm attaching these to the top and bottom of the back of the cabinet box to help strengthen and square up the entire thing. Each of the cabinets I am offsetting by 3/4 inch to the front of the bottom 2x4, and that's why I leave space for drawer faces, which I'll add later. But moving on to the drawers, I'm using 1/2 inch plywood for these. I'm starting by cutting out all the bottoms. They're going to be 18 by 18 inches, and then following that I'm cutting out the front and backs, which are also 18 inches, and then after that I follow up with the sides at 19 inches. Now for assembly, I'm once again just using glue and brad nails because that's easy and effective. And of course, like I said, for the cabinets, you can assemble them any way you want. One thing to point out is always be sure to double check the thickness of the plywood, because if you buy 1/2 inch plywood or 3/4 inch plywood, oftentimes it's not actually that measurement. Sometimes it'll be a 1/16 shorter. So always double check the openings in your cabinets for the drawers while you're actually figuring out what size you're going to cut the drawers to. In my case, I'm using side mount slides, so I have to be extra certain that they're going to fit, where under mount you get some more leeway. Now for the drawer faces, I cut out 21.5 by 23 inch pieces out of more 3/4 inch plywood. Now what I do is I cut out the one piece and make sure it fits in the cabinet bay, and I cut out each drawer face individually. This is a lot easier than trying to do a whole bunch of math for the drawer spacing and the cabinet height to figure out how to evenly cut out each piece. It's a little easier just to go one at a time, but of course whatever works for you is best. With the drawers installed, I have a couple bonus features to finish off this workbench. And the first bonus feature here is some T-track along the front that can hold these hold down clamps, but also it'll work for any other type of T-track accessory. And now dog holes are great. Obviously I'm getting some use out of dog holes in this workbench, but there's different types of modern jigs or accessories that fit in T-track, and I'm trying to get use out of both in this workbench. For the second bonus feature, I'm adding this craft paper roll to the side. This is something I added to my small workbench, and I liked it so much, it was so easy to add, that I decided I should really have it on this large workbench too. The really great thing about the craft paper is if I'm doing a glue up, I can quickly roll out some paper and I'm not destroying my workbench with a bunch of glue dripping all over the place, or I don't have to worry about waxing it to make sure it actually repels the glue. Now it's so easy to build, I put up the measurements here. It's literally just 3 pieces of wood screwed together, and there's a dowel going through the craft paper roll. That's all it really takes. So I think this is also a must-have for a workbench.